In the previous session, we explored the main contribution of Hans-Georg Gadamer to the philosophical hermeneutics. In this session, we will discuss the intriguing contribution of Paul Ricoeur, and that will prepare the ground for the next session to look at the requirements for a holistic and inclusive hermeneutical theory. The second important representative of hermeneutical theory that we'll discuss is Paul Ricoeur. Ricoeur is an interesting person for many reasons, and for people interested in hermeneutics and biblical hermeneutics, I think he has a lot to offer. So I do hope that you will explore on your own aspects of his thinking, which is rich, complex, and very rewarding to deal with. Now, what makes him different from Gadamer, they're both from Europe and the continent of Europe, but his background is totally different. He's from France. He has a Protestant background, which is quite unusual in France. He's fully versed in structural philosophics, semiotics, and all kinds of science and the interpretation of science as has been developed, especially in France. But he's also familiar with the postmodern debate, and he is able to engage over a wide spectrum. His orientation is not only France. He held for many years a chair in the University of Chicago, where he spent 6 months a year and then 6 months again in Paris. Now, what makes him so interesting is that his Protestant background gives him a feeling for the importance of the word, and therefore the text, and by implication also the biblical text, is for him a very important given, as we shall see, more than many of the other exponents that we've talked about. Secondly, he moves with ease between literary theory, linguistics, semiotics, in a way that enables him to span a wide field, which he then further widens by including historiography, identity formation, and many other fields. So he's a very complex person, but valuable in the sense that he identifies real problem areas, and then he tries to work there in a way that leads to a solution or leads an approach to the problem. Now, if we can contrast him with Gadamer, as is to say that in contrast to Gadamer, who sees distanciation or distance between the original text and the present reader, Ricoeur sees that as an advantage. He sees the written text as the only way, really, to bridge this gap historically, because it is the text that outlives the situation of creation or the original event of understanding, as I said. And therefore, he sees this as a strategic advantage, which also means that he lays heavy emphasis on the importance of the text, and especially in its written form. His argument is that oral tradition is also bound to the performance by the speaker, and in a certain sense really belongs to the original event of understanding. But the moment it is written, it assumes that not only a different medium, but a tenacity and a sustainability and a resilience that makes it possible for that text to move over centuries and still speak to us. Now, I think what is important is that with all structuralists, He lays heavy emphasis on the fact that the text is autosemantic, and that means it must be approached as an entity on its own, with a logic of its own, with a life of its own, and should not be confused with the writer's intention or the reader's reception. So the text has a life of its own and should be respected for that purpose. What he sees as important is the dialectical relationship between the static and dynamic elements in the text. The event of understanding that is then captured in the meaning in the form of the text itself, which must be analyzed for its sense in its own right, but then becomes a point of reference outside itself, and then explaining by the reader, but eventually leading to understanding and acceptance or appropriation of the text. What is important in Ricoeur is that he shares the emphasis on language, like Gadamer also has. But what he sees in language is something more than just the communication between the original event and the reader, or and the present or the contemporary reason. And what he lies emphasis on is the shifting potential of language. Now, this might sound strange, but I'll try to explain that. Already in his theory of metaphor, which was one of his famous books, he shows that the metaphor works only if it is familiar enough, but also strange enough. I mean, the metaphor to work must contain in itself something that's already familiar to the reader. But it creates interest when, at the same time, it brings something new to the table and combines the strange expression that the metaphor really is, the familiar with the unfamiliar. And in that sense, the metaphor is a shifting mechanism, is a way to move from one situation to another situation. Now, this shifting power of language becomes one of the important hallmarks of Ricoeur's approach, because that is exactly what he sees in the text, certainly a static representation, but the possibility in the text to open alternative ways of understanding reality. And this is what he means by when he talks about the world of the text. The world of the text is a proposed world. It's not a real world, it's a proposed world. And at the same time, the text looks or points beyond itself. Through imagination, through combination, the text brings into view an alternative way to look at reality. In doing so, Ricoeur then utilizes to the full, I think, the possibility of language to create change or to shift perceptions of people, to realize alternatives. Now, that means that there's no possibility to contain the text within the text, or to prohibit a new, unintended, really legitimate, if you want to call it, readers to read the text. And these readers, who were for the most part unintended, make their sense of that text reading in their specific context and their specific social location. So Ricoeur is not afraid of new readers, of different readers. He welcomes that. He says, because that opens up the hidden potential of the text, and that is an enrichment for everybody that deals with the text. Now, with that, he has also interest in history and historiography, and we will be dealing with that in one of the following sessions in more detail. But he shows that the way that we remember through memory is also a way that we can either change or retain, or try to retain the past. Which means that history and historiography for Ricoeur are also in some way opening alternatives, not only preserving the past, but again, adding to the possibilities that lie ahead. Coupled with this, and we will have a session on this on its own, is the whole question of identity. His famous book about self and the other shows how the identity or the formation of the identity of the individual is really dependent on the interaction with the other. Not only seeing yourself in the other, but it is in the interaction with the other that the identity of the individual is really formed and shaped in many ways. Now, this is a very complex theme as he works it out. We will be dealing with that in more detail very soon. Now, what makes him very useful for many purposes is that he shows that identity inevitably has a narrative structure. That means if we think about ourselves, we think about a history we think about a biography. We understand ourselves as somebody who comes from somewhere, who has undergone certain influences, who was shaped in many ways, and now find ourselves where we are. So the identity takes a narrative form. And this insight of Ricoeur has been very useful to apply quite in wide circles like organizational theory, where the identity of the company is also then interpreted as a narrative that can be changed as a narrative unfolds. So that has been a very important dimension, which means that identity is something that can be enriched, can be widened, can be broadened out. And for the concept of the fusion of horizons, that this is a very helpful and constructive way to think about it. Now, beyond Ricoeur, and I think that's important to point out that he's not influenced many other thinkers, but there are others that have taken up these themes, perhaps not directly from Ricoeur, but in ways that pursues or pushes our thinking in the same direction. One of these is the thinking of Francis Nyamyo, and I would like to introduce him to you. He's an anthropologist from the University of Cape Town, originally from Cameroon, but a very original thinker. So please look for his name and look for his articles, because he's a very, very interesting thinker. Francis Nyamyo, and we will provide you with a name in the text. Now, Francis has developed this idea of the incompleteness of the human being, of the human condition, which means that every individual is not only incomplete, but needs the input and the contribution of others. Now, you could say this is a variation on the theme of Ubuntu, which means human solidarity, and it certainly has its points of agreement. But I think it's a much more original way of thinking, because that leaves him to talk about conviviality in scholarship. That means interdisciplinarity is not an option or a nice to have, but this is really an obligation of different disciplines to talk with one another, not to merge, to bring their own contributions to the table, but to see the interconnectedness, even in the field of science, across also the borders of natural and human sciences. So this idea of convivial scholarship is a very interesting one to pursue and lies in the extension of what we've been talking about. The last concept that he develops is that of frontier scholars. Now, it looks very much like a Wild West kind of thing, but what he means by this is scholars and thinkers need to be adventurous, need to test the boundaries, might need also to cross these boundaries into the unknown and explore what has not been explored. That is, in actual fact, the very essence of the scholar. The scholar that is willing to leave known paths behind and venture into the unknown and cross existing barriers and frontiers. So there's a rich possibilities here from a hermeneutical perspective that follows in the wake of Ricoeur that is worthwhile following and exploring further. I want to end by emphasizing a fundamental dimension of this approach. And this really comes from Eberhard Jungel, a systematic theologian from Tübingen, a very famous person, who started out as a hermeneutical scholar when he was still teaching in the then East Berlin. From there, he migrated into theology proper, and I think for anybody in systematic theology, this is a scholar that you need to take notice. The importance of Jungel is that he asks us, what is our point of orientation? Are we fixated on the past, or are we oriented towards the future, and that means the possibility? And if the possibility becomes the norm, then it opens up possibilities, just as Ricoeur has all in his whole of his oeuvre stressed this point and promoted an orientation that goes beyond what is real to what is possible and what are the alternatives. So this makes hermeneutics really an adventurous undertaking, and I hope you also will be bold enough to cross borders, venture into unknown territory and bring something new, totally new to the table.